Hello again. Today we are going to be looking at the longest Psalm of Ascent, which is Psalm 132. We're getting near the end. Our pilgrim journeyer is getting closer and closer to Jerusalem, but we're not quite there yet. And again, this is really the longest Psalm of Ascent, Psalm 132. Lord, remember David and all his self-denial. He swore an oath to the Lord. He made a vow to the mighty one of Jacob. I will not enter my house or go to my bed. I will allow no sleep to my eyes or slumber to my eyelids till I find a place for the Lord, a dwelling for the mighty one of Jacob. We heard it in Ephrath. We came upon it in the field of Jaar. Let us go to his dwelling place. Let us worship at his footstool, saying, Arise, Lord, come to your resting place, you and the ark of your might. May your priests be clothed with righteousness. May your faithful people sing for joy. For the sake of your servant David, do not reject your anointed one. The Lord swore an oath to David, a sure oath he will not revoke. One of your descendants I will place on your throne. If your sons keep my covenant and the statutes I teach them, then their sons will sit on your throne forever and ever. For the Lord has chosen Zion as he desired it for his dwelling, saying, This is my resting place forever and ever. Here I sit enthroned, for I have desired it. I will bless her with abundant provisions. Her poor I will satisfy with food. I will clothe her priests with salvation, and her faithful people will ever sing for joy. Here I will make a horn grow for David and set up a lamp for my anointed one. I will clothe his enemies with shame, but his head I will adorn with a radiant crown. Psalm 132 is a psalm that is steeped in history, but it really is a psalm which speaks to us about the way of obedience on the long Christian pilgrimage of faith. If the previous psalm, Psalm 131, tried to kind of keep us in the middle, away from the poles of kind of an infancy dependence on God, and the other side, this kind of arrogant and ambition in life, if that tried to keep us in the middle, then Psalm 132 is really a psalm of kind of not letting us get too far ahead of ourselves, but not also letting us fall too far behind. Eugene Peterson, again in his book, A Long Obedience in the Same Direction, writes this. He says, in such ways, Psalm 132 cultivates the memory and nurtures the hope that lead to mature obedience. It develops a strong sense of continuity with the past and a surging sense of exploration into the future. It is the kind of thing we sing to stay normal without becoming dull, to walk upright in the middle of the road without getting stuck in a long rut of mediocrity. What the psalm is really about is maturing as disciples in obedience. And the way we do this is really steeped within our history. In reading this psalm, you'll have noticed there's many references to David. There's many references looking back further into the Old Testament. And what this kind of teaches us, what this kind of shows us, is that if we want to know the way forward with God, we have to know where we and where the Christian story has come from. The path to maturity is moving forward, but that path involves also looking back to God's story. And the story that is really highlighted here is the story of the Ark of the Covenant that was kind of buried away, and which David discovers again anew, and he leads it up the same hill that these pilgrims were now walking for the Psalms of Ascent. David led the Ark of the Covenant up this hill and into Jerusalem. It is a story of God's presence. It's a story of remembering God's presence, remembering that all that God did for David and all that God did for David's descendants, as he promised by his covenant to have a person from David's family always on the throne, and which we know is fulfilled in Jesus Christ. In order to walk stably, to walk upright on our pilgrimage of faith, we have to know the story that we have come come from? So that kind of our decisions that we make, the discernment that we make is not simply based on our whims, simply on how we're feeling, simply on our social climate, but it's based in the story of God and his presence throughout history, going all the way back to creation, which has formed us and led us to this point. But of course, if we want to mature as disciples, we can't just be perfect historians. We can't always just be looking back, but we also need to look forward. We have to have our feet firmly planted in the ground of history in our incarnational world, but we also have to have our heads lifted up to the sky to see where it is that God is leading. And this is what the second half then of the psalm is all about. We notice that the tense of the words all move to the future. I will bless her with abundant provisions. I will clothe her priests. I will make a horn grow for David. I will clothe his enemies with shame, but his head I will adorn with a radiant crown. To know what God is doing ahead of us, to have confidence, to walk our pilgrim journey, no matter what it is that we face within the future, no matter what barriers we might see on the road ahead, to do this with confidence, with God, with trusting in God's, I will provide, I will be with you. We need to look back to know how God has been with us. And once we have our firm grounding, our firm feet kind of grounded within the ground of God's history, God's story, we can then move forward with the confidence of this psalmist, knowing that God will be with us, knowing that God will provide for us, knowing that as the journey gets long, as the obedience gets long, as we might want to give up and kind of take another route or turn around and go back down the hill, we can trust that God will provide for us. God is walking with us. To grow in Christian discipleship, to grow in maturity of faith, we have to have both feet firmly planted in the ground of God's story. But we also have to have our heads lifted up in faith, knowing that God will fulfill his promises to us. Peterson concludes his chapter with these words. For the Christian, living demands that we keep our feet on the ground, but it also asks that we take that leap of faith. A Christian who stays put is no better than a statue. A person who leaps about constantly is under suspicion of not being an actual person, but simply a jumping jack. What we require is obedience, the strength to stand and the willingness to leap, the sense to know when to do which is exactly what we get when we have an accurate memory of God's ways, combined then with a living hope in his promises. Amen.